Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Uncensored CMO. Now, one of the books I've been recommended so many times is How Not to Plan by Binet and Sarah Carter. So I thought it was about time I got them on the show to find out all the tips about how not to plan, what marketers should be doing rather than what they shouldn't be doing. This episode is full of real good tips and tricks from two of the world's best planners who really do know what they're doing. So you'll enjoy this episode. It's full of great nuggets. Here's my conversation with Sarah and Les. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hello.
And Les, welcome to the show.
Hi.
I was just asking as I was preparing for this, we often lovingly refer to you and Peter as the godfathers of effectiveness, but I believe your godfather status actually translates into the real world. Am I right?
That's right, yeah. We are both godfathers to the same little boy, son of a mutual friend of ours that we've both known for very, very long.
So we have high hopes for the future careers.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I'm going to be very good at his religious education.
Now, some breaking news, of course, recently is Adam and Eve and John Lewis have parted company. So first of all, really sad news, but you must look at it with enormous pride because, I mean, John Lewis changed Christmas pretty much, didn't it, single-handedly? And, as you look back, maybe tell me, have you got a favourite campaign? I mean, I know it's hard to choose between your children, that sort of thing, but what would be your favourites?
I'm going to say, yeah, my favourite is the Long Wait, which was 2011, I think. So we were kind of 2 years into the campaign then. And I think perhaps a lot of people forget that the campaign has evolved from the start. So we had 2 years where we had sort of vignettes. We still had the sort of famous song and the lovely kind of observed moments, and it was very emotional, but it was vignette based. And this year, 2011, and the Long Wait was the first year we went to a single narrative structure. And we kind of got lift off that year, I think. All the kind of magic ingredients came into place. The music, the pre-release online, the beautifully observed story, the cute kid in the pajamas, no gift shown at all. It was actually wrapped up, if you remember. You didn't actually see anything. And it was the one where you expected the little kid to be excited because he was getting a present, but actually it was because he was giving a present. So there's that lovely little kind of rug pull at the end. And yeah, I mean, I feel that ad changed the shape of advertising, actually, not just Christmas, really, because I think from then on, it kind of taught the world about the power of emotion and the effectiveness of emotion as well.
I mean, that's one of the most profound impacts, isn't it, of the John Lewis advertising, because you're not really doing typical product advertising. You're really tapping into emotion, Christmas, nostalgia, so many different things. And it does feel like you've taught the industry a great deal. I mean, Les, what would your favourite one be? If you're allowed to say, of course.
The Long Wait was fabulous, and it did change everything. I also am very fond of Monty the Penguin, which it's quite hard to decide which of those two is better, possibly The Long Wait. But actually my favourite is not a Christmas ad at all. It's Always a Woman, which maybe has been slightly forgotten, which actually was before The Long Wait. So it wasn't a Christmas ad. I don't know if you remember that ad. It features a woman from cradle to grave, basically, and basically her living her life with John Lewis by her side throughout the whole story.
Not quite grave. It did feel like it could end up with that. It didn't quite go that far, but it could have.
That final scene, that final scene where, if you recall, the woman and her family, she's old, she turns to the camera and she sort of beckons you to follow her. Yeah. Actually, I'm literally getting goosepimples thinking about this. When I see that, that's about death, really. Yeah. And it was, I think, the beginning of us beginning to move towards this much more emotional sort of storytelling approach to things. It's just that actually Christmas was the place to apply it rather than...
And that was interesting because I hadn't really thought about that, but that was vignettes.
Well, it's a vignette.
It was vignette, but with a kind of within a narrative, wasn't it? So,
exactly. Yeah. Sarah's talking about vignettes because this is something we have a bit of a bee in our bonnet about, that vignette ads are weak and don't work well, and they're a cop-out, usually, because people don't want to see... You know, that's that thing you usually say about couples jumping off into the water, off a jetty, hand in hand, smiling, you know. all that crap.
They're kind of what's not to like, aren't they? A little bit of something for everybody, but don't actually tell any story that kind of appeals to anybody.
Well, I think you've touched the nail on the head, haven't you? Because it's storytelling is what I think John Lewis taught us. I mean, my favourite is Excitable Edgar, which is almost textbook storytelling. You've got the drama, the negative tension, you've got the character, the journey, the resolution at the end. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. You know, you really taught how to tell stories at Christmas. And the music, of course, was a big part. And I think people forget, don't they? Stories, music, emotion, characters, all these things are quite important, aren't they?
And just go back to Always a Woman for a moment. Other things that were in there, the storytelling thread. So there's someone that you care about. That's true of all of the great ads. There's a central character or characters that you care about and you follow them in a narrative. So that's very, very different from vignette ads. The other thing is music. That Billy Joel track. It's not garnish. It's part of the way it works. But where Always a Woman was different was that the other ads had virtually no product. That one was just loaded with practically every product in the store, wasn't it?
And so tell me how obviously, you've done some case studies on John Lewis looking at the return on investment. How have you evaluated what it did for the John Lewis business?
First of all, it's not primarily us that evaluates it. John Lewis have always used econometric modelling as their primary way of measuring the financial payback. And they've done that with independent econometric consultants, various ones that they used over the years. That's the central way they measure their sort of ROI. But when we put together our case studies, we look at a whole range of different kinds of evidence, from online responses to store footfall to tracking to everything else. But I think the very central core of it is there's a demonstrable financial ROI.
Yeah. I mean, that's really inspiring, isn't it? And I think it's proved to the industry that actually creating emotion and good stories is good business, isn't it? Creativity can be very good for business as well, which is, I think you've done a huge, contribution to the whole world, really.
The point that I've sort of made recently is quite often you get sniffy comments from people like, yeah, they're nice ads, but do they sell any product? I don't think so. And you just go, John Lewis themselves say that you spend £1 on this stuff and you get £10 of profit, not revenue, but profit back. With some of them, Monty the Penguin, I think it was £11 per pound spent. That's you don't get that from paid search or direct mail or anything like that.
And also, people tend to think it's just Christmas and it's just the big emotional ad, don't they? But it's all year round, and we do other what would be seen as more activation type, more classic kind of retail work as well, much of which is at Christmas is funded by the people whose brands they are as well, which all helps with the payback too. But it's people tend to forget it's part of a bigger piece. But you're right, I think it did for the first time help people understand that emotion sells. And there's the sort of specificity of a story can have wide appeal, because I think people get a bit muddled up with that, which is why vignette ads are so popular. They think you need to show everybody in there doing all sorts of different things, and that appeals to everybody. But what Hollywood obviously get is that you tell a story of a person and you get the emotion right. That appeals to everybody. So
going back to the vignette ads thing, it's the difference between inspiring an emotion and showing an emotion. And often vignette ads are about showing people, hand in hand, let's show joy. No, you want people to feel joy, and that can come from something quite different. I
mean, what I love about what the econometrics you've done is you've basically given the rational case for emotion. And from a former client point of view, the amount of conversations I've had with the board or the finance department about spending money on this very emotive, advertising idea, it can often be quite hard to sell in. And I think that's where the power of the work you've done to prove the business case for it is so powerful, because often, clients like me have had to kind of sell the crazy ideas into the boardroom, and I think that's where it comes in. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about planners, because I thought I'd tell you the story of where I first came across the long and the short of it, because I think this sort of illustrates the point quite nicely. And I was working on Lucozade at the time, and we had this big idea, and this is about 5 years ago. So probably, your book's been out good 5 years at this point. And we're locked away in a kind of room a bit like this, and I'm with 4 of the planners from Grey, our agency at the time. And I remember it was, as always with planners, it's about 45 minutes before you get to the idea. There's a lot of build-up. Anyway, first slide, long and the short of it, right? And look, with no disrespect, there's almost a slight eye roll going, and as we all know, the long and the short of it, you see. And I'm like, hang on a second. Whoa. Reverse up a second. Are you saying there's evidence for how marketers should invest between long-term brand building and short-term? Because if there is, I need to know and go back to my board and argue the case. Because at the moment, I'm on quarterly earnings targets and stuff like this. So I just wonder, what are your thoughts on? It's obviously a profound piece of work. How obviously, yes, but in the right hands, it really is quite powerful. And some of the arguments I'd have with the board about investing in long term, not just in short term, those conversations are happening all the time. So how do we get that message out there? I mean, even I know, is it 10 years? I think around 10 years now, isn't it?
10 years in July, I think.
Yeah. So I guess with the first question, how do you reflect on that work, and then secondly, how do we get this into the hands of the people that need it as well?
Reflecting on the work, it's a fabulous piece of work, and you should definitely buy a copy. Yeah, still available. Yeah, I think we hit on something. I think there's an idea in there, and I think it has some value. Actually, I mean, I suppose really it's still a hypothesis. This idea that there are quite distinct short and long-term effects, but it seems to be still gaining traction after 10 years, and I think it is helpful for clients to have a more balanced view of how to plan their activity and how it all works. So I think there's legs in it.
Very much a wear in versus wear out, I think, on this.
Yeah, I think so.
There's a bit of a theme there, generally, isn't there?
It's sort of
dare I say.
And Mr. Ritson helped a lot as well. I mean, he's done a great job in kind of banging the drum for it, hasn't he? And kind of popularising it, if you like, and endorsing it.
It's funny, actually. So when we originally wrote the thing, Peter and I were very adamant that what we wanted to write was a book. And we wanted a book, and we wanted it to be something that would be still selling in 10 years' time. And I think it's fair to say that the IPA were not that interested in that. In fact, if you notice, if you go back to the original stuff, they never refer to it as a book. They refer to it as our new report, as in a piece of news which will be out. But we definitely had the view that we wanted to write something that was going to last. And we almost had to kind of fight them about that. So even down to the format of the publishing. So that is clearly a book. How Not to Plan is clearly a book. Look at the thing. The format for the long and the short of it is. So I've had people refer to it annoyingly as a booklet, or your pamphlet, or whatever. Yeah, if you really want to fuck me off, then that's a good way to do it. But I think and it's in a sense it was part of a long running campaign which was still going on. So a lot of the ideas began in the first snappily titled book, Marketing in the Era of Accountability, which I still can't say properly. So I think in a sense we've lived our own principles of long term, not exactly brand build, but long term sort of campaign to change people's lives.
Probably the power of a key visual as well, thinking about it, because you got the kind of that one chart that everybody gets, the zigzag or whatever people
I think
call
you
it,
do need a hero slide.
Yeah.
I mean, as much as it kind of must pain you to go, well, you could read the rest of the book, couldn't you? But you sort of need one thing that everyone locks in on.
There was actually there was a definite moment. There was an aha moment there. So those ideas, the ideas behind that, go back to about 1995, actually. Frizzell Insurance, when I worked doing econometrics on this insurance brand, where it was both brand building and direct response, and using econometrics to tease out the effects, and just having this moment thinking, God, there's two effects with different decay rates. And I've been doing versions of that graph, which looks slightly different for some years. I did a version of the graph for the book, and Peter said, no, it's still not clear. And then I did the zigzag version. And I emailed that one across to him, and he went, that's it, that's the key visual. And at the time, it was kind of like, like you come up with something and you go, well, it's kind of obvious though, isn't it? But it obviously isn't.
It's a kind of system one visual, isn't it, for a system two bit of thinking. Yeah. So it's communication, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. It's like one of those moments when you create something which has got a life of its own, sometimes too much almost, because I've had people who seem to think, oh yeah, well that's the whole of everything Les and Peter have ever done. It's like either that or the 60-40 rule.
Well, that's hotly debated, isn't it? I mean, is it 70-30? Is it sometimes 65-40, 35? and all this sort of thing. But one of the hot topics as well is Ritson's bothism as well. I mean, to what extent do long and the short have to be separated? Is there ever a scenario where you can do both?
Okay. Well, I think Ritson, when he talks about bothism, he's not talking about doing both at the same time. That's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is that you need to do both. And he's making the point that it's the long and the short of it. And he says that in that title, the most important word is "and," which is a nice way of putting it. But he's not saying that you do it both at the same time. That's absolutely not what he's saying. In fact, one of his recent posts was precisely about why that was wrong.
And that was the brown paint one, wasn't it?
That's the one.
That's it, yeah.
So the point is that, and this is hard to get across to people because it's not black and white. Everything does a bit of both. A brand TV ad will have a slight activation effect for some people. A piece of crappy direct mail will have a brand building effect for some people. But the point is that the mix is different for the different activities. And trying to do both equally all the time in the same piece of communication is not a good mix because you've got conflicting needs. Brand needs to be broad reach, activation needs to be tightly targeted, brand needs to be emotional, activation needs to be rational, brand needs to be memorable, activation needs to be interactive, if you like. And you can't do all those things well at once. So yes, you need both, but doing both at the same time is usually inefficient, unless you've just got a tiny budget and that's all you can do.
Yeah, makes complete sense. You mentioned How Not to Plan, of course, which is also a really keen to come on
I noticed we haven't talked about it so much yet.
I really enjoyed it. And as I said, when I asked listeners what book do they recommend, this came very high. So, Sarah, I'd love to ask you about this. Let's start with, what's the one topic that you think marketers consistently misunderstand that you'd like to, if you could change one thing?
Well, I think it would be around the area of people's indifference largely to what we do. I think that's the thing that it's just so easy to forget in the day-to-day when you're absorbed in your product and your brand and you know so much about it. I don't have half as much circulating in social media as Les, but one thing that does seem to periodically go around is that quote of mine that marketers should all have a Post-it note above their desk saying, they don't give a shit about any of this, and indifference is the start point. It shouldn't need saying, but it seems like it does, and people seem to like to be reminded of that because it's just such a funny old job we have, isn't it? If you think about it compared with sort of a plumber or a hairdresser or a dentist, you're sort of equally invested in and interested in the outcome, but ours has just got this profound imbalance in it. The trouble is if you get that start point wrong and you don't start from indifference, then everything else goes wrong. You kind of junk things too quickly, you don't understand why you need to be consistent, you don't entertain for commercial gain, as you say, you think, why do I need a furry animal in this? You talk about landing messages and reasons to believe and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of think if you can get that start point right, then everything flows from that, but it's just so easy to forget that. Yeah, so that would be what I would remind people. And that's a kind of theme that just kept coming back and back, isn't it, really, through most of what's in there. It's really about that. I guess what Ritson would call looking at market orientation, he calls it, doesn't he? Looking through the other end of the telescope. And goodness, it's just so difficult to do and it's so easy to kind of get that wrong. So yeah, that's what I
One thing I loved about it was the kind of contrarian nature of it. There's quite a few myths busted in this, right? Isn't there? You've definitely taken a lot of the popular things we believe about marketing and actually demonstrated why they're kind of wrong, sort of thing. And the other thing I enjoyed as well, which was a pleasant surprise, again, putting my client hat on, is you don't talk about communication till a good halfway through the book. Was that an intentional thing to kind of, make sure that, when you're planning, you've got to consider all the P's, right? You can't just go, every answer ends in one of the P's kind of thing. Was that a conscious thing about writing the book, or
Well, we didn't consciously set out to write a book. I suppose we should say that to start with. This started life as a column called Mythbuster in AdMap, where we were commissioned, I think, to do kind of 6 or 7 or something. And we were going to take some kind of myths that used to annoy us every month and kind of just rant away at it, really. And then we kind of did it for 6 years. And then we thought, actually, not many people have read these in AdMap. Maybe we can put them together into something bigger. And then we kind of embellished it with to-do lists and what to remembers and all that stuff. So we didn't set out to write it.
It's worth remembering that how it started. Do you remember? Before AdMap. We pitched it to another, it was Marketing Week?
I don't know, possibly.
I'm going to say this.
Go on then.
So we pitched it to, I think, was it Marketing Week?
I can't remember. It might be
How not to plan 2, by the way, could still be an option.
And that could be an option.
We pitched it to, I think it was Marketing Week, as a series of columns about busting marketing myths. So that's where it started in this contrarian thing. And as you say, I think we had like about 6 or something. And Marketing Week saw no interest or value in it whatsoever.
Are you listening, Russell?
It was before his time.
Okay.
The editor at the time was actually quite cross with us for wasting his time.
But to answer your question, so I suppose that focus on the context of communication, not just communication, just came out naturally from what every month we'd have a little chat about what had annoyed us that month, basically. And so it kind of fell out naturally from that. But you can't really just talk about communication without talking about that context, can you? If there's a new cheesy product that some brand wants to launch, and 5 years ago they tried it and it failed then, and if they're going to support that, then they're going to neglect the core where you get the maximum payback if you're painting on a bigger canvas or whatever, or you need to be quick to mind, but you haven't got any brand in the stores, so distribution isn't, you can't really separate them.
But this kind of brings on, I think one of our challenges actually, from a planning point of view, is very often the planners are involved once a communication brief has been written, but really you need to be involved when the brand strategy is being written up front, further upstream. Do you guys have much involvement to that end? Because that's certainly when I've had the greatest success is when the planning team are literally in the brand planning meetings where we're going, here's the brand problem, here's what we need to go for. Much more powerful, isn't it, when you can get involved that
That's the classic BMP way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, we were set up at the end of the 60s, same sort of time when JWT launched planning, and that was very much the idea that we'd have a lot of planners in our department, enough to have a proper kind of seat at the table, arm in arm with the account. So we're not kind of stuck in some back room being kind of dusted off for a quick kind of and then off you go and we'll get on with the rest of it. So we've always very much been part of the process, and as you're right, defining the problem is one of the biggest parts of our role, really, not just kind of cranking out the ads further down.
It's probably worth reminding your younger viewers or listeners that, you see, people will think of us as Adam and Eve, or they'll maybe think of us as DDB. We're not. We're BMP. We were both part of the Bosma Simi Pollitt way of advertising. So Stanley Pollitt, the P of BMP, along with Stephen King, invented planning. And his view was always, I think, that it was firmly linking business objectives to marketing objectives through the 4 Ps and down into communication, right the way through the whole thing. Peter Field was also BMP. We are, the 3 of us are disciples of Stanley Pollitt, basically, and that very, very thorough marketing approach to planning, rather than some of the other pointy hat with moon and stars, mystical planning nonsense bollocks that has overtaken the world since then.
And I started off in marketing as well, so I guess I come from that background. So for me, it's always been part of that wider context, not really just sort of. I think it does, yeah. And it happened quite a lot. We used to recruit a lot of planners from marketing. It happens a bit less probably nowadays, but.
That'd be an interesting thing. So you don't get much switch between the sides. I mean, you know what I mean? But you don't get 10 people. I mean, actually, for me, first time I've ever done an agency role in the last 3 years. Fascinating, really. I really enjoy it because you can kind of see how this stuff gets applied.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't often happen that way either.
It's so powerful, isn't it? Because there's so much rich intelligence out there and, wisdom that any marketer, in fact, this is why I set the podcast up, actually, is just to connect marketers with great planning and great thinking that's out there, because it's all available. Now, I'd love to go through all 66. Now, we haven't got time for that. So I've picked out 10, and I thought I would, pitch one each as we go, just for fun here to see. So I thought I'd start with how not to get caught short, right? So see what I did there? Obviously in honour of the 10 years and all that sort of thing. But a little pivot here, because Les, I noticed you did some interesting work with Meta about the, even the long-term benefit of what might be perceived as short-term. Can you explain a little bit more about, because you end up with a 60-40 again?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't work with them. All I've done is I've done a couple of speeches with them and I've sort of publicised what they've done because I liked what they've done. So they've commissioned a whole load of econometric models from independent econometrics consultancies to try and measure the short and the long-term effects of different media. And their overall conclusion, and you can see why I might like this, was that about 60% of the payback from advertising comes from the long term and only about 40% from the short term. And that even for things like, online video or social media, a big chunk of the payback comes from this long-term effect that people have often missed. They're obviously thinking along the same lines as Peter and I. Again, it feels like there's a sort of drip of bits of evidence from different bits of the industry, which is corroborating some of the things we say.
I mean, it's really profound because it just changes how you might evaluate a campaign. Yeah. So if you're looking through a short lens, you're going to draw one conclusion, open the, filter a bit, look over a longer period of time, you might draw another conclusion. So it's really good. Then, so number 2, how not to be consistent. So Sarah, I thought I'd ask you about this one. So one thing that marketers love is change. Now, it drives me insane, and again, I've got to blame myself here, kind of being client side, but you have your annual planning reviews, rebrief the agency every year. So much good work goes to waste, doesn't it? I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, well, we wrote about that a lot in here, didn't we? Because I think, one of the great skills of marketers is knowing what to change and what not, and when to change and when not, and that is hard. But I think there has just been a default to change, a far too big a default to junking everything that goes. I mean, I always think it's quite ironic when more and more companies are interested in sustainability that they never apply that to the ads. It's just like rip it up, chuck it out, let's do another one this year. And there's a number of reasons. I think there's the myth of wear out, which we wrote about quite early on, didn't we? And I think, with all the studies that we've seen, and there've been some big ones, there just is no evidence for that at all. And even a certain tracking company who'd have thought would be rather invested in encouraging people to junk everything and start again and start testing have acknowledged that there isn't such a thing either. And in fact, wear in is much bigger issue, as we've talked about with John Lewis and your Kevin the Carrot and all that kind of stuff. So most ads don't get a chance to wear in because they're all junked too soon. So that kind of myth of wear out is one of them. People like making new shiny things, as you say. You don't get any marketing week headlines by,
Old campaign runs again.
Keeps running his old campaign for 10 years. Well done, John.
Ferrero Rocher back on air again.
You're not going to get any headlines from that. So, and then I think, and I think this is changing now, there's been a kind of misunderstanding or lack of knowledge of the importance of, distinctive assets and fluency and all that stuff that you talk about. And people, even, really big respected clients have acknowledged that they've been far too playing fast and loose with these sorts of things. And they now realise that continuity is important. And it all comes back to that indifference point earlier as well. People aren't trying to work out whose ad this is for, and they're just not going to do that. So, but I think that's changing. It feels like campaigns might be coming back again, because at one stage when we wrote the book, I think we only could think of Walkers and Felix. There just weren't any other long-running campaigns. They'd all gone.
I am wondering, strangely, whether the current challenges we're facing economically are actually forcing a little bit of this. I mean, we just finished a huge study for a very big global brand. Can't see who they are. But the vast majority, we tested a significant number of that, retested a significant number of their ads over the last 4 years. And every single one except the very specific time-limited ones linked to sponsorship of big global sporting events, right, should we say. Everything else wore in. And we even looked at length of time, we looked at spend, we looked at every variable to try and cut it in a way to disprove it. And we found actually, in most cases, now the impact was from small to reasonable, but in almost every case, wear in existed rather than wear out.
So the large research company that Sarah's not willing to name, which I will if you like, well, it's Millward Brown, because they published it. So their own published work said wear out is very rare, except for occasions when it's an announcement type ad, which obviously, that's different. Having said that, actually, we have a recent example of the Schmackos thing in Australia, where there was a much loved campaign in Australia for dog treats, which it looked like it was gradually becoming less effective over time because it'd been running for a very long time. And the sort of animation techniques that they'd used were beginning to look, it was just like the film was looking old and crappy, And rather than completely junking it, what they did was they effectively refreshed the campaign using more modern animation techniques, and boom, it worked again. So it was a bit, the thing just looked dusty, I think.
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because I've often thought that design companies get this far more than agencies. If you go down to the Museum of Brands and Packaging down the road, you've got these wonderful displays of 100 years of Persil packaging or whatever, and you can't see the incremental change.
You have to look at the beginning and the end to see the change. All the bits in the middle are quite...
But they kind of get it, and then the chopper and changes of the ad world, it's the same principle. You need to know what to change and what to freshen up. And it's often bad research, I think, behind this wear-out myth as well. If you ask people, are you getting fed up with seeing it? That's very different from measuring the sales effect and finding it actually still works. And it's, again, you're talking to people in a kind of system 2 mindset if you're asking that. And that could be a frequency issue, not anything inherently wrong with the ad as well. So...
And the counter to that design thing is that famous Tropicana example where they radically redesigned the pack and sales fell off a cliff. I think, as you say, when they refresh a logo or whatever, it's often because something like the font's beginning to look old-fashioned or something like that, and it's just a little tweak. That's the kind of thing that, I think about. All of a sudden, I'm thinking of I can't remember, was it Bisto or Oxo or both, where the family sort of underwent, or indeed our PG Tips things, where the basic idea was the same, but the PG Tips chimps, the family sort of evolved with culture, didn't they?
And then changed into monkey.
Yeah,
it wasn't a chimp, but it's the same
That is a
thing.
really good point, actually, isn't it? Because it doesn't mean you don't change. It means, but you just keep the familiar assets and the idea and the, all those things together. So you can evolve it carefully.
Yeah,
can be very, very successful.
And your work on fluent devices has been brilliant. I mean, that's another thing where I think 10 years ago people didn't understand that, and it's now that has now got into the kind of vernacular, and people do understand that.
If I had to pick one thing from my colleague Orlando, I have to say the fluent devices thing is really neat, isn't it? Because it's a bit surprising, isn't it? Because you go, why have a chimpanzee in your ad? Or what's a dancing gorilla doing? Or whatever, or meerkats, or so many cases, aren't there? And people must go, you're crazy. Imagine the client meetings go, so we open on this scene and we've got this Russian accent meerkat, what on earth's going on?
So, at one time we used to have Dulux here in the agency. We didn't create the Dulux dog.
No, I think he existed before we worked on it.
But actually 2 weeks ago I was in Rotterdam talking to some people who work for the company that owns Dulux, which is Nobel, not ICI anymore. But anyway, they were talking about how outside the UK, the idea of the Dulux dog in the ads is just utterly baffling. They go, why would you do that? You can't put a dog into an ad for paint, and they can't quite work out why it is that it still works over here.
There's a quote in the book about, I'm not having a rodent selling my product or something like that.
Favourite quote. It was from the Quaker Oats client when we were developing ads for Harvest Chewy bars, which were kind of nutty bars, and the ad was some sort of squirrels trying to nick it off someone who's eating it on a bench or something. Yes, and he said, I will not have my company's fine products endorsed by a rodent. I love that. And I've come across that with other clients when a certain financial brand, we proposed some sort of primate, and I have a similar sort of thing. I will not stand up at my company sales conference with a primate endorsing my credit card. But it comes back to indifference again. And as you said, you need to entertain for commercial gain and all that kind of stuff.
Just get over yourself. Clients and plenty of people in agencies take advertising and marketing and all this stuff far too seriously. And they think it's more important than it is, and they take it seriously as well. One of my favourite quotes is from Deborah Mills, who used to work here, who apparently in a meeting, it was with Jacobs or someone like that. There's some long, complicated meeting about discussion of club biscuits, I think it was, and she just finally snapped and went, oh, for God's sake, it's only a bloody biscuit. And I always think that should be over the door of the agency, like sort of in stone.
I think I spent 13 years, I think it was, at Britvic, and we just had the equivalent of that, which is it's only fizzy pop. And you had to kind of call that in a meeting at some point. Yeah. Hang on a second, it's only fizzy pop.
Nigel Beard, it's only advertising, nobody died.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we talk a lot about animals as well, don't we? Yeah. And then we had that little section on the power of fur, which we thought we'd do a whole chapter on that. But the great John Webster, who, as you know, used lots of furry animals, Cresta Bear and Hofmeister and honey monsters and all that, he used to say that it's not important that a campaign has legs, but that there are 4 of them and they're kind of hairy, which is probably right. And again, if, with a rational head on, people can't see what's in. There was a lovely quote with John Webster. He did the Cresta Bear, and this is a long time ago, but he presented it to some rather serious American client. He said, but why is there a polar bear in it? And he just said, well, why not? And that's kind of it, really. There doesn't have to be a kind of rational reason. Animals are quite good at selling things, well, as you've shown as well, that animals and babies.
And I think, we always hypothesised, haven't we, that it's one of the things it does is it sort of diffuses the rational mind. It takes you into another space where you gets your guard down. And I think you see this in another way when, in the last couple of years, with people having, Teams meetings and Zoom calls from home, when you're having a very serious meeting about, quarterly cash flow and blah, 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 and then the dog bounds in, or the cat goes in front of the camera, or a little kid comes up and starts wanting, to play with the toy. And all of a sudden, people switch mode and start to be human beings. I reckon meetings would all be more productive if you had some kids and animals in them.
I think that's exactly right. I remember it wasn't you, and a research company used to correct for the sales effect of animals if you had an animal in it, because it gave
correct
you
up or down?
down, because it gave you an unfair advantage if you had it. You think, well, that's kind of the point.
Well, this is really geeky point. I just make a quick geeky point. So Orlando did this amazing correlation between different features in advertising and their level of attention, and he worked with T-Vision on this. And the number one thing that captures the most attention and creates the most emotion was animals, right? Totally backing out what we just said. It's amazing. I mean, it's very forensically done, but it's very, very interesting.
And incredibly valuable properties for clients. Again, as Webster used to say that, you've got them forever, they don't cost you anything, and they're not going to molest children or anything either. You're not going to get into trouble with it. Yes, you have to pay use, but they're still using the honey monster, I think, aren't they? 30 years on or something.
Might be, yeah.
Felix the cat, 30 years on, that's still there.
Another one, the same research company that you're not willing to name, I think, didn't they used to correct down for music as well? So that, because, a good way to get through pre-testing was to put a banging track on it. So they go, well, that's an unfair advantage, so we'll dial down for that. But that's missing the point, that music
it works for a reason.
Really does work.
Well, I mean, it's fair enough if it's a track you're not going to use. I get that. But if you are, then yes. Yes.
Well, moving on maybe to... Actually, no, let's stick with the nonsensical. So how not to make sense, Sarah? I thought that this... the customer's not nearly as rational as we think they are. I guess that's probably the summation of what we've just been saying, isn't it? Is that, we take ourselves too serious and we probably assume a bit too much rationality with our customer.
Absolutely, yeah. Things don't... I think it was a Paul Smith quote we used it in the book, wasn't it? That don't make sense. And well, you've mentioned Russian meerkats. I mean, there's absolutely, why Russian? Why Russian accent? What's that got to do with anything? But it's that kind of why not Cresta Bear thought, really. And it just, comes back to indifference again. You want to entertain people, and a lot of the stuff that's most entertaining doesn't make rational sense. That plug boy thing in the Sainsbury's ad, that the one's a little scene. There's often a little thing like that never plans, often accidents actually.
I don't know that one.
Oh, in the Sainsbury's ad, there was that great little boy who kind of dressed as a plug, wasn't he, in the nativity scene, and just kind of ran and jumped, and everyone was sort of sharing plug boy memes.
It's because it's so non-nativity. You know what I mean? Everyone's got the traditional nativity, and he's just this big plug. Yeah. And he doesn't run and jump.
He jumps, and you think he's Velcroed on it or something,
and he
isn't
gets
he?
stuck to the wall like this at the end of it. It's just... It's those details, often, isn't it?
I mean, if you research that on an animatic, it'd be very easy to grind that out, and you think, what on earth's that got to do, and then get rid of that. Yeah, we talk about the round bags, don't we, in the book, which I worked on PG Tips at the time when we had square bags, and we got wind that the Tetley were coming out in round bags, and you think, what's the sense in that? It'll still be the same tea, still taste the same, but they took over brand leadership. People quite like round bags. They feel kind of cozier and kind of tea-like, and didn't make any sense at all, but it worked. So, don't iron out all the little idiosyncrasies. And they often come about from accidents. I think the Dulux dog was an accident. I think that wandered onto the set or something.
Pet along and then ran
I think it wandered onto the set,
I thought that's the story about the Andrex puppy, but one of those too.
But I think the reason that the accidents work is because they're not logical, and so they kind of, you're forced to break out of what you would in a logical way think is not right. But if some accident, like the smashed Martians, I know this is an old ad, but still one of the Britain's favourite ads, that they fell over at the end, so that when the Martians laughing, and everyone thought that was intentional, that they fell over laughing, but actually the models fell over, but it just looked really funny. And again, you'd never plan for that, but it's these little things that go wrong that often are the bits that people remember. Really easy to iron out, but they're the bits that work.
I think more generally, people are not that rational. More and more as I go on through life, I think the rational mind is important, but actually it's very little of what people do.
There's a famous quote, I won't get this right, isn't the famous quote about people don't say what they think or do what they say? It's very, very
think how they feel, say what they think, or do what they say.
Yeah. That's a very good quote.
Ogilvy. But no, it is. It's absolutely right. So you need to look at what people do rather than what they say, hence the power of the John Lewis measure at the end, or what's actually working econometrically, and don't fiddle around and doing concept testing and all that kind of validated storyboard.
One of the things I was thinking about recently was the fact that very often if you look at different cultures or different times through history, you see people doing the same things with the same feelings but different reasons. And it's like, it feels to me here that the behaviour is driven by the emotions, or is bound up with the emotions in some sort of double causality. And then the reasons are the post-rationalisation, which varies from place to place and time to time, but the same old thing, So quite a lot of our sense of morality and so forth in contemporary society is bound up with 2,000 years of Christianity. We've just taken the same feelings and then put new rationalizations on them.
We're forever post-rationalising the same emotion, really, aren't we? Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Moving through the P's a little bit then. So Les, you're famously notorious about, your dislike of the price promotion. Oh, yeah. So I thought I'd ask you about this, how not to change your price. So why are you so tough on price promotions? Because, again, client side, everyone loves a price promotion.
Two things. One was years of doing econometric modelling. Maybe not everybody who thinks about econometric modelling or market mix modelling will understand that in order to do it properly, you've got to measure price effects. Otherwise, the models are wrong. And when I first started doing econometric modelling in a high inflation world, clients would ask us to measure the effects of advertising. But probably the most valuable thing that we got out of the models was measuring the price effects and the effects of promotions and the price elasticity. Because that allows you to fine-tune your pricing and make loads more money really easily. I think the focus moved away from that as we moved into a low inflation world and people stopped caring about price. It's just prices suddenly becomes a lever that's sort of not being used anymore. Anyway, years of doing that, and I just kept coming back to the same results. These price promotions are not profitable. These price promotions are not profitable. This is losing you a lot of money. And then I started researching the academic literature on that. And there is a whole raft of stuff in the academic literature that says the same thing. The problems being that when you do a price promotion, you get a big surge of volume and it looks really good. But actually, a lot of the time, that volume is not incremental. You're either bringing forward demand or you're diverting demand from elsewhere. So you're selling much less extra volume than you appear to be at a lower price with a lower margin. And very often that means that you actually lose money. So, in fact, I wanted to publish that. I have some stuff on that, which I still haven't published now. I wanted to publish that back in 2006. And I've been banging on about it for years. But it's kind of, I suppose it's gone quiet, but now inflation is rising again. The reason I'm talking about it a lot now is that if promoting doesn't make sense in normal times, it really doesn't make any sense in a world where costs are rising and margins are under pressure. But many clients just don't seem to see it. It's rather, I've also said similar things about attribution, is you can see what looks like a really big effect, but it's illusory. It's not actually incremental business.
It's probably coming back to the point we talked about earlier, isn't it? Is the time frame at which we look at things completely changes our conclusion, doesn't it? Because that would be a classic one.
So an interesting thing is that when we first started in the business, it was not so obvious that price promotions were a great thing to do, because that was in the days when sales data was typically bi-monthly. You remember that? Bi-monthly Nielsen. And if you're really lucky, you got monthly Nielsen. And when you look at the bi-monthly figures, you can't see any effect. Yeah, you can't see it. You do promotions, well, that didn't have any effect. The minute they got EPOS data and got down to sort of weekly and daily sales data, they were going, wow, the effects of price promotions are much bigger than we thought they were. No, they just appear to be. And I think that EPOS technology was the reason that there was this huge surge in moving money from comms to trade spend.
Yes. Yeah, that makes complete sense, actually, because if I look over my career, I've basically been fighting this rearguard action, basically, to defend kind of comm spend or brand spend, and it's almost like this drug. It's particularly in a PLC where you've got to deliver quarterly results. You're looking to squeeze your promotions in to max that particular quarter out. It really drives the wrong behaviour.
Yeah, and it's just like a drug in that you get a temporary high.
This is a problem, you see, because you go, well, the retailer says, well, last year you did 16 price promotions, something like that. And then they go, well, this year you're going to do 18. So you just get on this site and eventually you run out because there aren't enough weeks in the calendar. And then what do you do, sort of thing? And this is, by the way, circling back to the original long and the short of it conversation. That's what I found so profound about the book, is because you could then demonstrate why if you don't change that dynamic between the price promotion drug and your investment in comms, you're going to end up getting to a plateau you can't get beyond.
I think there's a deep analogy with that and something like heroin, which actually heroin is much maligned. But, you get a temporary high, and then the low is really horrible. And you have to overcome the low, you need another hit. And so you get these spikes, but the long-term trajectory is down. You keep getting worse and worse and worse. For many years, I within, for example, the IPA, I used to sort of say, the advertising industry used to get very worried before digital comms about direct marketing. This direct marketing is stealing our lunch. And I was going, no, it's not. It's trade spend. Trade spend dwarfs the comms budget, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And that's the enemy.
Do you know the thing that annoys me about trade spend? It drives me mad is the P&L, because it's a variable cost, right? You're spending, well, in the case of the company I was working for, tens of millions, right? But because it's a variable spend, no one really saw it. Whereas the fixed spend of advertising, which is lower down the P&L, stands out like a sore thumb. And when times are tough, you go, well, we better cut John's advertising budget, hadn't we? And I'm going, what about the 50 million over there?
And there's an analogy with what's happened with, online advertising, in that I believe that EPOS data meant that you could suddenly see an immediate short-term payback from trade spend that you couldn't see in the 1970s, let's say. And so money was siphoned from comms into trade spend. And then with things like digital attribution, clicks, you could suddenly see a very immediate short-term gain from doing short-term online activity. And that siphoned money away from brand building. So, the comms pot had got smaller, and then suddenly the proportion of it that was spent on brand building got smaller. And it's the same mechanic. Well, then the fundamental thing is measurement. It's having a dial which seems to tell you something, gives the marketer immediate feedback that they've done something right. They respond to that. So it's a funny old thing, because it was really like the more detailed measurement systems have got, the worse marketing's got, I think, because it all pushes you in the direction of the short term.
It does. That's very profound. I'm the proud owner of one FE, because funny actually that I know obviously agencies proud number of FEs and lines as you walk in reception, always get knocked out, don't you? But and I think clients do that a lot less. But I remember the one case study that I got the FE for a few years ago on the brand I was working on was almost a perfect example of this, because in this particular example, we actually reduced trade spend from 70% of volume to 50% of volume, so 50% on promotion versus 70% before. Distribution stayed the same, and we launched a new campaign, which I'm very proud of. It is one of the beautiful ones where the insight was great, the execution was, really followed through absolutely nicely. Sales went up 48%. I was telling you this one before we chatted, and it got a bronze FE. And I went up and complained to the jury afterwards. I'm like, where was my gold? They said, John, your sales didn't go up enough. And I'm like, what do you mean 48%? The reason I felt frustrated was I felt like I had to explain the context of the other Ps. And I said, you've got to understand that, advertising was in isolation doing all the heavy lifting here in this particular case, because we reduced all the other P's. The place was the same, so distribution was the same. I've never forgotten that. I've got a case study here that shows it.
Rightly crossed.
Anyway,
that just tells you something about the Effies, doesn't it?
We better move on. So, Sarah, how not to be different? This is a lovely one, isn't it? The perennial debate between difference and differentiation, of course. Now, every marketer's grown up with a point of difference, right? Engineer as many points of difference into my products as possible, but it turns out that distinctiveness might just have the edge over difference.
Yeah, and this all comes down to whether you say something differently or you say something different, doesn't it? And I think, there's a lot of learning now to say that actually saying something differently is a perfectly good strategy, and actually often a better one, because marketers and ad agencies traditionally tied themselves up in knots, sort of dancing on pins, trying to find something, anything you could say that was different and ownable from your competitors. And usually that's either so small it's kind of inconsequential and no one really cares, or if there really is something that big, then it's just going to get copied anyway. So it's a perfectly good and effective strategy to take a category generic and talk about it in a distinctive way. And there's loads of examples of brands that do that very well. I mean, Specsavers is just saying you see better when you've got glasses on, really, isn't it? Or, Old Spice, you smell nice when you use this, or Walker's, it's irresistible. I mean, you couldn't get more generic than that, but it doesn't matter. It's just as long as you do it in a distinctive way, that's the important bit. So it's another one where getting the end of the telescope right is what's important, really, that people have, competing brands that they're perfectly happy to switch between. They don't really think there's much difference between them. So these little fine benefits that we kind of sweat on concept boards and things are just, people don't really care. So
well, we're sort of back to what you said at the beginning, isn't it, about customers care a lot less than we think they do. Therefore, difference is a lot more, distinctiveness and standing out is a lot more important than a minutiae bit of difference.
Absolutely.
For the engineer.
I mean, they don't have enough knowledge of the competitors to know what's different anyway. So it's just assuming an interest and a knowledge that just isn't there. And it's far, and if you're not seeing these comms and linking it to your brand, you can dance as much as you like on Heads of Needle talking about, but if no one remembers it's you, then you're not even off the starting block, really. So again, your kind of work on fluency and distinctive assets, so it all kind of, there are recurring themes, aren't they? They're all very interconnected, and I think we're getting better at it again, but there's still a lot of sort of reason to believe thinking, and can we own this kind of questions and things going on, which clearly are just wrong and don't matter.
Again, there's a sort of wider point in a way, which is that with communication in all its forms, how you say it often matters more than what you say. So right now, the book I'm reading at the moment is Ian Leslie's book, Conflicted, about how to have disagreements and so on. The stuff I've been reading so far, a lot of it is about that. It's not making the points in an argument; it's how you make the points and how you build the relationship with the person that you're having a debate with. If you want to change their mind, you've got to get the emotional temperature and everything right first. And all of that links to the stuff we were saying before about, rationality versus emotion and so on. But, we have this model of advertising as being a communication, a delivery mechanism for a proposition or something like that. And I'm not sure that's what most of it's doing. It's about, Paul Feldwick talks a lot about, what's the name? Is it Václavic? Václavic, and building up relationships and I often talk about, we're not in the business of communicating with the public. We're in the business of training them, to want our products. Yeah. It's not all about rational persuasion or whatever.
And you've got a nice framework, haven't you, here about how advertising works, haven't you? Which I've always admired. Can you explain that, the sort of framework about how advertising works?
The trouble is, I won't remember exactly what I said, but I can put it in another way. The advertising has two roles. Brand advertising is about talking to people long before they buy and gently nudging them towards, preferring your brand by having a long-running conversation where you make them, broadly speaking, feel. First of all, you make it easy for the brand to come to mind, and you make it sort of so that people feel vaguely positive towards it when it does come to mind. We like that Jeremy Bullmore quote. Can you remember that one about the products that people buy, they quite like them?
And they quite like them. They buy them a little bit more often because they quite like them and kind of stuff. It's
we're
quite
not
mild and nudgy, isn't it?
It's nudgy.
Driving and conversion and all that kind of stuff.
The point is we're not inspiring brand love. We're just making it slightly more likely that people will think of the brand, and that when they do think of the brand, they quite like it. And then the other role for advertising is, when they're in the market, is to go, here I am, I'm the brand you want, and make it really easy for them to buy. Sort of thing.
There's a lovely quote, isn't there, about people are very loyal to the brand that's easy to find, which I thought was quite good, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think brand loyalty
is
a term we should probably just abandon altogether.
Well, brand loyalty and brand love, right? I think they're the two candidates for the bin, aren't they?
Yeah. Brand love is just nonsense for most people most of the time. There are brand fanatics in every category, but largely they're deranged individuals. Brand fanatics are basically people who they're like the stalkers of the brand world. Most of them should probably be locked up. But ordinary people just kind of quite like brands. Loyalty is a slightly more complicated thing, because for a start, the term brand loyalty, if you examine the way people use it, it's used to mean a whole load of different things, which are all not necessarily the same thing. Retention, frequency, weight of purchase. One could even make an argument, as we did, that looking at price elasticity or price sensitivity or lack of price sensitivity is a kind of loyalty. But really, most of what counts for loyalty is just inertia and habit. It's like, loyalty, there's a difference in a marriage between loyalty and just kind of not being bothered to go and find anyone else, sort of thing. And the main thing what passes for loyalty most of the time in marketing is, you just haven't moved on yet. I remember once getting a phone call during dinner, back in the days when the landline still worked, just at that moment when you don't want to be interrupted, and some guy going, hello, I'm from British Telecom, and since you hold 2 of our products, that counts you as brand loyal, and therefore you're, just going, I'm not fucking brand loyal. I'm about to have my fucking dinner,
By the way, I had no choice about this connection.
Yeah, exactly. The presumption that by looking at my buying behaviour, he's deduced that I'm his loyal servant. Fuck off.
Well, I've got a theory on this one, because I had the ominous task when I was marketing director on Lucozade. We did the first reformulation in a long time, forcing us by the sugar tax, right? That came in 2016. So we had no choice but to reformulate, which is, on a brand as iconic as that, is complete disaster. And I won't go into all the war stories. But I remember at the time, we had inundated with customer complaints, and there's this lady in Ireland who was particularly vociferous in writing stern letters and all the whole thing, right? And eventually I was like, okay, I'm going to have to phone her up and see what's going on here. Anyway, she was drinking 30 bottles a week, right? I said to her, what else do you drink? And she goes, nothing else. Lucozade and water. That's it, right? And she was apoplectic because we'd reduced the amount of glucose, and it was literally causing her not to sleep, and the whole, and when I then in a proper Byron Sharp fashion, I then got the team to go, can we just look at how much volume actually people like this account for, and can we look at the frequency of purchase and all this kind of thing? So fascinating, because what we discovered is that we were very overexposed as marketers to the people like her, right? And so they were our Twitter feeds, they were in customer complaints, they were popping up in the 1 week sales promotion data, all that kind of thing. So the problem is they were front of mind for us. Then we looked at the data, right? Average frequency of consumption over the course of a year, 2 bottles. Yeah. That was the majority of volume. And it got I say worse. It got even more interesting.
The mean or the median?
Well, there we go. So we got even more interesting, because I then got this weird bit of data where apparently 40% of our buyers were new. And I'm like, 40%? It can't be right, because the population's not big enough for every year.
Annual penetration.
Annual penetration.
Exactly.
Exactly. So I'm going, this cannot be right. So I said, go back and run the data over 3 years, right? Came back. Basically, we had some very light buyers. So basically, they were people that just occasionally got ill, occasionally drank Lucozade, And they may happen to buy one year, not the next year.
Oh, I mean,
That's pretty typical of most brands, isn't it?
I would imagine, because I think my sense is that Lucozade has sort of changed since we were kids, you know. But when we were kids, it was the thing you had when you were ill. And, you know, going back into my childhood, it was probably something I had 5 times because, you know, there were 5 occasions when I was that ill that you needed Lucozade, you know. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't.
You are 20% of the population, Les, that for whom they didn't buy every year. They bought less frequently. But it was really profound because when we were coming out with the relaunch and the new campaign, we originally were planning around an 8-week. We thought 8 weeks was enough to cover everyone, right? And I'm like, hang on, this needs to be more like 8 years. Yeah. Like, forget 8 weeks, you know. Can't possibly get to all our light buyers in that time.
I still haven't had standard Lucozade since probably the 1970s. Although I have had Lucozade Sport. Right. Anyway, I better stop talking about Lucozade, but let's end on this question. I'd love to know, I mean, you cover a lot of things in the book and lots of myth busting. If there was one topic you didn't cover in the book that you would do today if you wrote the book today, what would it be?
I think purpose, because I think we'd have a lot to say about it now. And I think we've actually got a lot of evidence which could lead to a more kind of nuanced discussion and debate on it, I think, rather than the kind of binary yes or no stuff that's been going on over the last few years. So I think I would like to do a chapter on that if we did a new book.
I can see a good follow-up to the podcast then.
We didn't touch on this earlier on, but the articles started out as a myth-busting thing, but very quickly it evolved away from that, didn't it? Because we didn't used to call it Mythbuster to ourselves. We called it Grr, because we realised that the thing that worked best was if we found something that we were cross about. So I think that's actually the secret of the book is it's a very angry book. Every single article, there's 66 things that made us cross. So, and I think that's why it was so fertile, because we would come across, we'd float ideas and, you know, bat them back and forth between the two of us. But the ones that worked were the ones where we both went, oh God, that's annoying, you know. And few things are as annoying as the whole purpose myth bollocks.
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Let's keep them hanging on that. Les and Peter.
Sorry, love.
Sarah and Les. Competitor. It's me that he has the relationship with, not Peter.
The other man.
The other man, yes, my rival.
Well, thank you so much.
It's been lovely to talk to you, thank you.
We'll have to bring Peter in for a cameo.
Well, yeah, and of course Peter taught some bollocks about purpose, doesn't he?
He does. Well, there we go. He's tried to do his bit, hasn't he? But thank you both.
Thank
You're
you.
very welcome.
It's been fun. Thank you.
That's very enjoyable.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening and watching The Uncensored CMO. That was my episode with Les Binet and Sarah Carter. Hope you enjoyed that. And if you want to get other episodes like this, then please do subscribe. You can do that over on YouTube. You can also do it where you get your podcasts. If you want to follow me, you can do. I'm over at Twitter at UncensoredCMO. I'm also available on LinkedIn where I'm under my normal name, John Evans. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time.